Welcome to our interview series, 15 Minutes on Edge, under the theme of the new talent paradigm. This week, our esteemed guest is Dr. Siddhartha Das, General Partner at Ventureast, a prominent early stage venture fund with a focus on technology and life sciences. Welcome.
Thank you.
Right. How have you been?
Good. Good.
Great.
Glad to be
So,
here.
Siddharth, it would be nice if you could tell us a few words about yourself, a brief intro if you could give us, and then we can begin.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, Ventureast is an early stage fund which is primarily focused on tech and life sciences. And we have been one of the earliest funds, venture funds in India. And currently, we have offices in Bangalore and Hyderabad. Earlier, we also had an office in Chennai. And we have we have obviously a very large portfolio of investments that we have done over a period of 2 decades. I came into the fund a little later and in some ways was one of the co-founders of the technology part of the fund. And because we had separate life sciences practice and technology practice. And in terms of my prior background, before I came to Ventureast, I was heading strategy and corporate affairs for Intel in India. And prior to that, I was also the country head for Intel Capital in South Asia. And Intel Capital was one of the first tech investors in India at the time. So that's kind of my brief background. And of course, prior experience in the US with Intel, also studied in the US.
Okay, great. So, to tell our viewers, the aim of this interview is to give a hawk-eye view of the hiring situation in the tech and the non-tech industry, with special focus on internal talent management strategies and solutions. We want to try to understand the problems faced by organizations in managing their workforce and helping them build their careers or charting their career grade. So, in this respect, my first question is that in the prevailing microeconomic milieu, recruitment has been constrained. There exist three phases characterized by shifts in positions regarding team responsibilities, talent preferences, and numerical requirements. And this framework was initiated last year during June, July, to be precise, when numerous entities revised their positions on hiring figures and the desired skill mix with their establishments. Consequently, a novel paradigm emerged. Organizations were compelled to scrutinize their internal workforce more meticulously, not necessarily with the aim of downsizing. Yes, downsizing majorly also happened, but to comprehend their staff better, to understand their needs, their skill sets, their career objectives, where they want to go, and sync them with organizational objectives. So, how do you see this trend shaping up? Where do you see internal talent marketplaces going? And what are your views on this?
Sure. So I would, start by taking a step back. So what are the trends that we see? Obviously, these trends are something that take shape over a period of time, and we have to kind of follow the trend and question why these trends are happening and how do we respond to these trends. So one of the obvious trend is that the new age businesses require new age businesses. I refer to businesses which are primarily internet related. They have had about a 20 to 30 year kind of a run if you consider the US as the starting point. So clearly these businesses require a certain level of adaptation to new realities. One of the new realities is, of course, the pandemic. The pandemic has disrupted the way we operate, the way we work. So that has been one of the kind of features of over the last 2, 3 years. That there is a pandemic which defines a certain mode of operating within the enterprise. The other point is that we are also in a different demographics in terms of there are more millennials in the workforce. There's also much more of a driver for a gig economy. And so these are also some of the trends that we have to kind of respond to. How do we best respond to these trends? And of course, the underlying, which is I would consider kind of a horizontal trend, which has been happening for a while, is the focus on automation and AI, which is also having a disruptive influence. And how do we manage the talent, and how do we recruit talent, and how do we retain talent? So I would say these are kind of the 3 or 4 trends. Now, in the 90s, we went through a kind of a similar disruption when the internet economy started. And there was a very famous seminal book that was written by, I think, Champy and Hammer and Champy. And that was called Re-Engineering the Corporation. And that was driven by more the need for the new economy kind of requiring us to have a much more of a focus on process and orientation. And that's how, this whole enterprise, business processes came along, SAP and so on and so forth. I think 30 years down the road, we are similarly at a crossroad where talent management is core to the enterprise. So we have to figure out how do we manage the talent in the organizations very differently from what we were used to, perhaps for the last few decades. So we are at that crossroad. So these are some of the trends. Now, how do we respond to the trend is obviously, I'll wait for your next set of questions. And, but
Okay.
that's kind of a snapshot of the environment and the macro and so on.
So at this point of time, I want to talk about industries like fintech, banking, telecom, pharmaceutical, and healthcare. So these sectors are considered recession proof. They barely see any recession, but they see a high volume of churn. There is a historical lack of understanding in these organizations that there are people coming in and they're going out. And the concern is not about going in and coming out. Of course, that concern exists, but there's a bigger concern here that organizations at that level have is when these people go, when they're moving out, they take their clients, customers. So basically, they take data, information along with them. Right. And you said that the whole paradigm has now changed. So what are such industries doing? How are they managing to stop that transfer of data? Right. And why do people leave? Primarily, if we can just give a snapshot, they don't see any career progression. Right. So they're going out, they're getting a job somewhere else. So what are organizations at that level doing about that, stopping that data? Because today data is what rules. If you have that data, you are in the business, right? The whole operation works alongside. So what are they doing for it, about it? How are they ensuring that the workforce stays, they grow inside the organization, the churn is minimized?
No, that's a very good question, and I'm sure a lot of senior management is kind of been racking their gray cells in terms of how to solve this problem. But this is a problem which sometimes it's a good problem, sometimes it's a bad problem. The thing is that if you look at the industry, for instance, the information technology industry, over the last 20 years, the churn has been quite high, especially in IT services industry. IT-enabled services and IT services. It's always been very high. And one of the reasons, obviously, the good reason might be that we were expanding as an economy. So there were much more opportunities that were growing. And obviously, employees saw a path to their growth in terms of looking at opportunities outside their companies that they were working at, which is a growing trend. We are not in an environment where there are people who spend decades in one company. They look out for better opportunities outside. True. So this has been happening for some time. Now, some of it is related to perhaps compensation. You can call it the inflation of comp in the industry, and people obviously were attracted to a better comp and benefits and so on. The other part of it, which you mentioned, is about they don't see growth within the company in terms of their own growth path. So that brings up, obviously, to the question of how do companies address that? So obviously here, Edge Networks is right at the core in terms of the talent management. So I would say they're core of the enterprise. How do you manage your talent for whether it's retention, whether it's growth, and even recruiting the best talent? So Edge obviously has worked on these solutions. They have huge experience in terms of working with some of the largest companies in the space. So here the point is that companies, there is obviously one aspect of it is how do you develop these plans, which used to be called individual development plans. Today, I think what you have to do is give some of the tools in the hands of the employee. So it's not just a once or twice a year meeting with the manager and figuring out what their growth path is. This is something that they have the tools in their hand. They have, in some ways, control their own career destiny or career trajectory. So
Mm-hmm.
enabling them, empowering them with the tools is obviously number one. Number two is from the standpoint of the corporation, how do they manage their talent optimally? How do they manage it? Because today, the way corporations have operated, especially very large corporations, they don't necessarily have a talent directory or in terms of how they can optimize their talent. It's primarily organizations have kind of have verticals within the company and people kind of grow within the verticals without much kind of insight or visibility into what's happening outside the vertical. So the whole idea is to create some kind of a knowledge base where companies and the management both figure out better the needs of the corporation in terms of where the needs are, what the skill sets are, and definitely they're going to be more efficient in terms of how do they move employees, because in some ways moving employees is also in a way you have to cross skill them. So that may be one retention strategy, that you cross skill and move them. Sometimes it may not be just a upward move, which in our language means promotion. It may be a lateral move, but the lateral move may actually provide a better career trajectory for the employee. So how does the enterprise figure out that? The more they have solutions like Edge, which empowers both the management and the employees, that cross-skilling and upskilling can happen with more agility and rapidity so that the corporation kind of optimizes its resources. That's the way I see it.
True. So we know that this is happening, right? Given our experience at Edge and everything, we know organizations are implementing talent management strategies and solutions where, as you said, there may not be vertical growth, but there's lateral growth. People are being skilled, upskilled. They are given options where they can choose which direction they want to move, right? If I may ask you, as somebody who has outlook about the industry, is this a reason today why organizations are freezing hirings? Because internal employees are being mobilized well. People, those who've been on the bench, are being moved to different verticals or reshuffled into projects. But every day, we are also seeing organizations tightening up their strategies, right? Like today, I read a news that Cognizant is laying off about 3,500 employees.
Mhm.
So where is this trend leading to? Where is it? Where do you see this going towards? How is it going to impact the industry per se?
See, first of all, the reason why it's happening is perhaps some of it is obvious. We are in the global macros, certainly there are a lot of headwinds there. And companies cannot afford to grow at the pace that they were growing, at least in the foreseeable future. So, and obviously a corollary effect is they might have hired, more than they were required to during the pandemic, expecting kind of the demand kind of opening up. And perhaps in cases where that hasn't occurred, now they are forced into retrenching. So one of it is clearly the global headwinds that is driving that. The second is, in every industry, there is a maturity cycle where the competitive landscape changes and you get into more of a hyper competition. So you're forced into some kind of efficiency drive. And that efficiency drive means how do I utilize my talent better than I have been doing. So that is the other consideration, that every industry goes through a maturity cycle. And in the beginning of that cycle, you see less competition. As you get into the peak of that cycle and on the down cycle, you see more and more competition, leading to hyper competition. So to that extent, efficiency is then the driving factor. Innovation may be the driving factor in the first phase, but eventually it's efficiency, innovation and efficiency. So that's what's driving some of that. Now, obviously, it's forcing companies to look at talent management in the same way that they used to look at business processes, starting in the 90s. Everyone was obsessed with business process efficiency. So that's why they were implementing a lot of business processes, automation, and so on and so forth. Today, I think the human talent is what is the focus, will remain the focus. That how do you utilize your human talent? Because obviously, companies are faced with many imperatives, cost cutting being one of them. But they're also, what does cost cutting mean? Other than headcount, it also means real estate cost. Office spaces now are getting shrunk because you're expecting the employee not to sit at the desk for 5 days a week, 8 hours a week. That's not how corporations work today in the gig economy. There may be, so they are shrinking the workspace also. So all these is driving much better focus or more focus on talent management, because the talent may not be sitting right under your nose. It may be in a virtual workplace. How does a manager or a supervisor manage that virtual workplace? Not somebody that they sitting in the next cubicle that they can just call.
True. True. So, as you said, and I totally agree with it, that today workers are in charge. As again you said, that has led to a very big trend, the biggest trend I could say of this decade, redefining how do you attract, retain, develop, and employ your people. So, and also there is a, as you said, that today it is very very possible that the person that you're interacting with day in and day out may not be in the next cubicle. Right. So, which brings us to a point that there is a demographic drought. Reports have suggested that the size of the workforce is shrinking. However, the working population in every developed country is starting to peak. The World Bank data says that the total population in highly developed countries will peak around 2045. After this, only countries like Africa, Indonesia, and India will continue to grow. How do you see this shift? This workforce shift, what potential does it hold for the Indian economy in the future, for jobs, careers, everything around this? What are your thoughts on this, sir?
I think obviously, if you look at, much more optimistic view of this, is that we are going to generate a lot of talent, some of which will reside within the country, and some of it will be essentially addressing, the it in other geographies. So you're going to have a large talent pool. Both insourcing and outsourcing will happen. So all that is positive trend. What we have to be concerned about, that we are training. See, when you're part of a global talent pool, one has to be cognizant of two things. One is technology cycles are getting shorter. So to that extent, the training department has to be much more alert and agile in terms of how do you upskill people, because if technology cycles are shorter, then this talent pool, to be very productive, you have to have continuous training so that they're upskilled in a continuous manner, so that there is no obsolescence that sets in, because it's usually the obsolescence which leads to sometimes major layoffs. An industry may not find the skill set relevant, and that's how layoffs happen. How do you kind of counter that? With continuous education, continuous training, because of the technology cycles being much shorter. The second is, if you bring in the aspect of AI, which everyone talks about. Now, you have to look at AI and say that if AI can do conversational stuff, like conversational AI, or AI can do like Chat GPT, generative AI, then the human interface, at what skill level does it need to be relevant? Because you have to sit on top of this conversational AI and generative AI. So that's something that one needs to kind of engage with in terms of the discussion on talent development. How do you develop talent so that talent is always relevant and superior to your AI solutions? That's how you keep gainful employment.
True. So when we talk of skills, upskilling, reskilling, the first thought that people have is tech. It's a tech. We are talking about the tech companies, right? Whereas non-IT employees, they barely get any skill development trainings. So what are the changes that are happening, especially after the pandemic, where the whole shift has now moved from just hiring an employee on merit? It has moved from, of course that's there, but it has also moved to a phase where people are being hired for their skills. Skill has become very very important. What are the changes that have been reflected after the pandemic, in your view? What have you seen?
Well, some of the evolution and obviously automation and AI has been happening for some time, and pandemic probably in some ways, while it was disruptive in some sense, but it also focused on how do you work better from virtual sites and so on. So it's kind of a semi-automation in a sense that you have to think about. Now, if you look at industries outside of the IT sector, the financial sector, BFSI sector is obviously one that is grappling with these issues. They have the same churn in terms of, in the banks, they have the same churn in terms of relationship managers of the financial professionals and so on. So clearly, they might be a little behind the IT sector, but they are grappling with the same issues because obviously they are also bringing in technology at a much faster pace than they ever did before. So, conversational AI, for instance, is something that the banks are implementing. So, the banking sector is cognizant of that the technology integration implementation will have an impact in terms of how they train their employees. So I'm sure there is a ripple effect from that is happening. Now, in terms of the other industries like the ones you mentioned, healthcare and all that, those are, as you mentioned rightly, some of these are secular sectors. So the question is, in healthcare, I don't have visibility in terms of how much of automation will displace the human interface because it's still a very, very human intensive kind of an environment, the whole healthcare. But you do see if you go to the hospitals that there is a greater focus on automation and so on and so forth. So the people are also getting trained because the moment you bring in automation, automatically the people who are kind of implementing the solutions or they are executing on those solutions, they have to be trained. So, but I don't have great visibility. Only ones I can talk about IT and PFSI sector, which are obviously is a huge market for the whole talent management.
True. This is a question that I've been thinking about, and it may sound a little repetitive, but this is something I want to ask you is that what is the impact of the shortage of high demand skills on companies' ability to hire their way to growth? And how does this necessitate a shift in HR operating models, if you can say, towards systematic people solutions? This is something that I want to know how important and critical it is today to identify and fill positions thinking about career pathways for employees, how important it is, and where do talent management solutions and strategies, what role do they play here?
Well, clearly, critical functions exist in every company, and in some ways, one has to focus a lot more in terms of succession planning, so that you have people trained to take over. Because critical functions are also the ones that are highest in demand in the industry. For instance, when I was at Intel, I remember that this was almost 20 years back. There was a critical shortage of analog designers. Certainly, there were a lot of IC designers, but more on the digital side. Analog designers were few. So that was a critical function. And you have to have some way of retention strategy. You have to have succession planning so that there is also some level of redundancy. So that's how you manage it. So obviously, in talent management solutions, when you are basically looking at upskilling, cross skilling, although critical functions is not something that lends itself to a lot of cross skilling because it's primarily a vertical skill, a very specialized skill. But you have to consider succession planning and upskilling as part of the roadmap. And obviously, if the business grows, then people see an opportunity. That's how it works. I don't think there is any magic solution. I think every company deals with it in different ways. But it's obviously something that managers have to be very, very cognizant about that who are the key employees in my organization.
True. So this brings us to the end of the interview. So as you said that it is important for every organization has their own HR tech implementations that they are thinking about or they are not they are implementing. Those who haven't are looking forward to implement it given the change in the workforce of the future. So where do you see these implementations on from a business perspective? How do you see them growing? Talent management solutions being implemented in organizations. From a business perspective, how do you see the growth?
See, talent management, can't be looked at through the narrow prism of just an HR development. Gets slaughtered as an HR process, talent management. It's really you have to make the business case, which means that the business managers have to get involved that this is something that is good for the company, it's good for their business, it's good for the top line and bottom line. You have to have, it can't be seen purely as a cost center, that you're spending money to develop people. No, you're actually developing a business case for higher productivity, perhaps higher profitability, perhaps expansion of the business. So the business case is much more important than merely saying that I'm upskilling or cross skilling the talent. So it's something that really involves the executive office. It involves the business managers, the senior level business managers to make the call that this is core to the enterprise, which I'm repeating because business processes became core to the enterprise. Now, talent management, if it's core to the enterprise, it's not just an HR function. It's really the executive office decision.
True. Because the future of the business depends on it. Because until they understand what skills are needed, where who needs to be upskilled, and what they need to be upskilled, organizations can't define their business objectives well. I totally agree with you on this. So great, sir. It was a pleasure speaking to you. Your insights are invaluable. They're going to go a great way in. If I could put it this way, that these people who are viewers, once they listen to it, I'm sure they'll be able to chart their business plans, their career graphs, the way they understand the business well. And this is going to be really of prime importance to them. So thank you so much for giving us your valuable time. I know you're very busy, and to take this time out must have been a massive deal for you. But thank you so much for your precious time. It was really a pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you, Ananya.
Thank you so much, sir.